Thanks for coming to the continuing education session on behavioral finance. My name is Ulrike Malmendier. I teach at UC Berkeley, and then over there, Nick Barbares from Yale. He and I will be sharing this session, and very excited to give you our ideas about what's going on in the field of behavioral finance, what's interesting for research, or maybe also useful for teaching. Given that I work mostly in corporate finance and Nick on the asset pricing side, was a natural split up to have each of us do that with a slight twist, which is just to kind of anticipate a little bit what's going to be coming in the corporate finance session, and also set the stage a little bit for the whole conference. I'm going to give a little bit of a brief introduction. Then we're going to switch to Nick in about 30 minutes. Initially, we had some ambitious plans that we would maybe even throughout the 3 days we're going to have here together, or one full, and to have switch back and forth a little bit, because he's going to talk about overconfidence. I'm going to talk about CEO overconfidence. Nick works a lot about biased beliefs in finance, biased belief formation, and with the area of experience effects. I also work in the same, so we thought we would maybe link a little bit more. Turned out to be too complicated to make it feasible. So as a result, we're going to proceed as follows. So if you have my deck of slides, I'm going to give this brief introduction, then it's going to be all Nick's for the next 6 to 7 hours. And just at the end, I will add on a few things to talk about some aspects which link a little bit to the perspective I'll also bring forward in corporate finance, to perspective on behavioral finance, and then finally move to the behavioral corporate finance part. So I hope that works for everybody. So if you have my set of slides, I'm just going to talk about the introduction, and then we're going to move over to asset pricing. I think we were imagining it like mostly, I don't know, seminar style or maybe summer school style. Do feel free to interrupt and ask questions. I think we both like active audiences. At the same time, we are hoping to get through everything fast enough so that at the very end, there's a last session of 45 minutes. Maybe if there's demand, even more, we can leave open for discussion, maybe of research topics or anything you'd like to follow up on. So with that, let me get started. So I thought before we jump into really the finance part, I did want to give a little bit the big picture of where behavioral economics or psychology and economics stands. And one of the reasons why I'd like to do that is that I found, as somebody who works both in non-finance economics and in finance, I found it curious to see how in finance we've been zooming in on particular biases or particular aspects where we deviate from the standard classical model, while other areas have shown more interest of other concepts, and thought more deeply maybe about the underlying psychological concept. And I'd really wish to import some of that into behavioral finance personally. So while behavioral finance is maybe one of the early success stories for psychology, for bringing in psychology, because so much rich data supported it in the field, not just in a kind of small lab sample. On the other hand, you sometimes find that kind of papers are written, something doesn't quite work out according to the classical model, and then almost like an afterthought, some behavioral assumption is thrown in, and I think it would be really good to work the other way around. So what do I mean with that? If we start from the classical economic model, just kind of very baseline, we have our agent maximizing his lifetime utility, so that's some U which depends on the state of the world and on the time, say, and he's trying to figure out how to maximize his expected utility, weighting it with some P, and then aggregating that over his lifetime. I mean, I'll let go to infinity there. You might think about your hairs. Given his set of lifetime strategies, we do have kind of the standard setup. Well, actually, it's only the standard setup you find in your micro textbook. If you add some ancillary assumptions which are often not directly spelled out. For example, people being self-interested, so you depends on your consumption only, not on other people's consumption. There's no habit formation. We are assuming quasi-convexity and so on. And so what psychology and economics or behavioral economics tries to do is to improve the realism, psychological realism of our models and generate thereby better empirical predictions or attempts to explain puzzles which we previously haven't been able to attempt. So let's start from beliefs. We want to improve the assumptions about beliefs. So in reality, our P might deviate from some objective fundamental probability due to over-optimism or overconfidence, due to limited attention. We don't pay attention to everything, even if the information is readily available, or persuasion, which by other agents. We try to improve not only beliefs, but also the assumptions about preferences, so that you as T, as I said already, depends typically on your own payoff, but we know from numerous field studies and lab experimental studies that people care about the allocation to others. So for example, in ultimatum games, where one person proposes a split of a given pie of, say, $10, and let's say we're in a situation where he makes a pretty unbalanced offer, $9 for him, $1 for the other person may reject, even though that means in an ultimatum game that both are getting zero. Or the famous Kahneman-Knitsch-Stahler paper showing that people really mind it if you increase prices at certain occasions a lot when the demand spikes up. For example, shovels after a snowfall, and might demand and profits might be lower than they would have been if you had stayed at the previous price, which under a rational model is not profit maximizing. Other examples are that utility might depend on reference points. There might be endowment effects, loss aversion, so we're not just having like a curved utility, but like a kinked utility, really don't like to go in the loss domain. Narrow framing, we don't think about our whole, what I call capital L, the lifetime, the set of lifetime strategies, but we're only going to consider a limited set. Finally, like the way I like to split it up, last piece where we want to improve how realistic our models are the maximization process themselves. So even if we have formed rational beliefs have standard egoistic preferences, while we might deviate from that process because of time inconsistency, beta delta models, bounded cognition, bounded memory, or again, framing, representation biases. And so I think that's my big picture of what behavioral economics is. Now, not everything is necessarily against the standard classical model, right? I mean, with utility, you can do a lot of things, and nobody forbids, for example, to put in like the allocation to other people. But as I think Colin Cameron at some point had a version of non invariano ergo ad hoc. So if it's not invariant or MWG, it's ad hoc, and we call it behavioral. But let's be really clear about that. So with beliefs deviating from standard belief formation, Bayesian updating, we are immediately in the field of behavioral. In fact, a lot of people sometimes use behavioral models and irrationality interchangeably, but it's not only that. It's also if I'm a Bayesian updater but have non-standard preferences, that I don't purchase a certain good or asset if I think the price setting is unfair. There's something about the process of price setting I don't like. Well, we are not in the standard model. Now, just super briefly, as I said, I wanted to give you kind of like a taste of what other fields have done. So if you go, before we get to finance, to consumer choice, kind of IO, to public finance or labor economics, you're going to find a lot of people worrying about time preferences so that you have some time inconsistency in your decision making. I've myself have worked on people paying in order not to go to the gym, like signing up for their health club, saying I pay $80 per month rather than $10 per visit because of course I'm going to go at least twice a week, and they go 3 times a month, and so exposed turns out that wasn't a good idea. And whether you look at work in taxes, retirement saving, on addiction, job search, and labor, these kind of variations of time preferences has played a big role. Much less so, I think, in finance, even though you could think maybe you are entering a certain financial contract, a type of retirement saving, a type of savings device with certain intentions in mind, and you might be deviating. So household finance does some of that. I don't know why it hasn't spread more. Reference dependence is certainly something we share. Social preferences. I care about what's allocated to other people. Again, it's getting a little bit an entry into finance now with impact investing or trying to form, good conscience portfolios where I kind of try to exclude weapon traders or environmentally damaging firms, but still not modeled out very well. Narrow framing, I think limited attention shows up by more conceptual thinking about narrow framing, like in public finance with the flypaper effect. So if money is collected out of a certain source, say cigarettes, they feel obliged to spend it on health related to that. Is some of that maybe happening in finance as well? Earnings I get from some asset, I'm spending on certain things and not on other things. So I think here a couple of examples might be useful to think about, even though we won't discuss them much throughout the rest of the course because we want to cover what has been done in behavioral finance, but to kind of keep in mind as something to think about from time to time, whether it's worth to explore that in finance as well. And let me see if there's anything missing. I think I've mentioned most of it. And then, just to have a few examples turning to finance. So narrow framing we share, loss aversion we share, overconfidence. In fact, if anything, I think the most literature is in asset pricing and corporate on that, but many other things are left out. So kind of just summarizing what I said before, some fields have really focused on one type of behavioral assumption, maybe a few types. In behavioral corporate finance, for example, the field I'm going to cover, has been a lot of emphasis on beliefs, in overconfidence in particular, and I don't think this is necessarily the only promising agenda. So given that we are thinking so hard about what these CEOs do day and night, do they have certain preferences? Do they have ego utility? Is their framing kind of different from that of the standard rational consumer in a way that's worth exploring? So I think there's a big research opportunity, which I'm not going to talk much about, but wanted to mention in the beginning. All right. So with that big picture introduction, as I said in the beginning, here's kind of the structure. I think I laid that out already. Now, one thing I wanted to do before I hand the microphone to Nick is, given that I will be talking after Nick's part on asset pricing is finished, a little bit about some add-ons in which I'm going to be trying to emphasize a little bit what I'm going to be calling perspective 2 in corporate finance. And you haven't heard the corporate finance part yet. Let me give you a little bit of a preview. So basically, when I think about the literature in behavioral corporate finance, one really good way to organize the research that is done is to distinguish between what was, in some sense, the early research, where people thought about, okay, we're modeling markets or corporate decision-making and market response in a certain way right now. I don't think the rationality assumption about investors, about individual investors in particular, always applies. So some literature started having first a pretty vague notion of investor sentiment, investors sometimes being too optimistic in their beliefs, sometimes too pessimistic, and then saying, well, might rational managers be responding to that perspective, and may that help us to understand certain puzzles, such as waves in issuance decisions, stock finance mergers during periods of high investor sentiment, etc., things I'm going to get back to. Later on, then literature almost started in almost like a parallel universe, which said, well, how about managerial biases? Are these managers really always rational? Or might these guys who have been really successful in their life so far, reach the top of a company's CEOs, be subject to biases such as overconfidence? And if we model that, are there biases such as, again, maybe merger waves, which we are better able to understand? So one string of literature, the first, what I call perspective 1, has looked at systematic deviations from the standard classical model on the side of investors, and then looked at the managerial response in equity issued, equity finance mergers, etc., such as, for example, the work by Malcolm Baker and Jeff Wergler, who say, well, to understand why at certain times there's so much equity issuance, you just need to take into account that investors are sometimes too optimistic, high investor sentiment induces excess issuance of equity. Like a similar argument has been applied by Schleifer and Vishny for merger, for equity finance mergers. That's a model we're going to work through together. But you can also go away actually from the individual investor, go to the individual employee, and look at papers like the paper by Paul Oyer or Nitai Bergman and Dirk Genter on companies maybe using stock-based compensation in particular when they're having over-optimistic employees which are overestimating the value. On the other hand, then, perspective 2, we have managers who systematically